Hey guys, tonight we begin with a mountain man trying to put on a frozen moccasin before sunrise, which is one of those small historical moments that sounds almost funny, until you remember he may have to walk miles in it. The title promises the deadliest winter of 1836, and we are going to treat that carefully, because the Rockies did not leave us a neat scoreboard of every storm, every hunger night, and every man who did not make it home. But the danger was real enough. In the fur trade country around the Green River, the Snake River, the high valleys, and the cold passes that fed the Rocky Mountain rendezvous world, winter could turn a famous mountain man into a very tired animal with a knife, a blanket, and bad options. That is the first illusion to break. The mountain man was not safe because he had buckskin clothes and a dramatic hat. The mountain does not care about your hat, which is rude, but consistent. He survived, if he survived, because he knew which little problems had to be solved before they became large ones. The fire before the feet before the trail, the horse before the load, the meat before the pride, the powder before the hunt, and the camp before the dark. By 1836, the Rocky Mountain fur trade was already a world with rules, habits, debts, shortcuts, and disappointments. Every summer, the rendezvous system pulled trappers, traders, native families, guides, pack animals, missionaries, curious travelers, and piles of goods toward meeting places in the mountains. For a few bright weeks, the wilderness became a market with horses, robes, traps, tobacco, coffee, blankets, powder, lead, gossip, and enough noise to make a quiet valley regret being discovered. Then the fair ended. Goods moved out. Pelts moved east or west. Men moved back into the cold spaces between maps. If you enjoy this kind of calm history, where one frozen shoe can expose an entire survival system, you can like the video, subscribe, and comment what object near you tonight would become completely useless in a Rocky Mountain winter. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So imagine the camp before daylight, not the painted version with a heroic man standing on a ridge, looking thoughtfully at destiny. Start lower. Start with smoke caught under a lean shelter, with ashes breathing red in the dark, with a blanket stiff along the edges, with a horse shifting somewhere beyond the firelight, because hunger has made it impatient. The man wakes because cold has entered the places sleep was supposed to protect. His nose hurts. His hands are slow. His shirt, if it dried at all, dried in the shape it chose for itself. Near the coals are his moccasins. They may be better than nothing, and sometimes better than heavy boots for moving through rough country. But they are not magic. If they went wet into the night, they may now be stiff as small boards. He cannot simply force his feet inside without risking skin, pain, and a morning that starts badly and gets worse. He has to warm them without scorching them. He has to work the lever. He has to wake up enough to make careful decisions before breakfast, which is not ideal, because breakfast may also be a theory. This is where survival begins to look less like courage and more like housekeeping under threat. A man who can shoot well, but cannot keep his bedding dry, has a problem. A man who can tell a good story at rendezvous, but cannot judge when clouds mean trouble, has a problem. A man who spends too freely in summer and enters winter short on powder, lead, blankets, or food, has created a future version of himself who will be very disappointed. The mountain men of this period were not all the same. Some were free trappers who liked to think they answered only to themselves, except when they answered to hunger, weather, debt, trade prices, and the limits of a horse's back. Some worked in company brigades, where independence came with more structure and sometimes less choice. Some had close ties with native communities. Some had native wives and families. Some survived because they learned from people who already understood the country far better than any newcomer did. A clean legend usually leaves those people out, and that is one reason the legend looks cleaner than the winter. In the cold season, Every decision had a cost that moved through the camp. If one man wasted ammunition, the problem was not only his pride, it could mean less meat. If one horse weakened, the load had to be shifted. If a party stayed too long in a valley where grazing was poor, the animals paid first, and then everyone else paid after them. If men pushed across open ground when the sky was closing down, the mountains might accept the mistake without comment. The weather did not need to be spectacular to become dangerous. A steady cold could do what a dramatic blizzard did, only more politely. It could harden tracks. It could make fingers clumsy. It could thicken streams with ice. It could turn a small tear in clothing into a line of pain. It could make smoke hang low and bitter under shelter. So the same fire that saved your hands also filled your eyes. History enjoys making comfort arrive with a complaint attached. And the fire itself was not a simple answer. Fire meant fuel, and fuel meant labour. In some places, wood was near enough. In others, a man had to drag it, chop it, break it, or save it. A camp placed for shelter might be poor for grazing. A camp placed near animals might be exposed to wind. A camp placed near water might also mean ice, mud, and the slow irritation of doing every task with wet hands. The map in a mountain man's head was not only rivers and passes, it was a map of compromises. The 1836 world also sat near the late edge of the classic rendezvous era. Beaver still mattered, but the trade was changing. Competition, exhausted trapping grounds in some areas, shifting markets, and the rise of other western routes all pressed against the old rhythm. A mountain man entering winter was not simply a lone adventurer. He was part of a business system that could make him rich in stories and poor in almost everything else. So when he finally softens the moccasins enough to get his feet inside, that little victory is not little. It means he can stand. If he can stand, he can tend the fire. If he can tend the fire, he can check the horse, look for meat, mend a strap, scrape ice, watch the sky, and decide whether today is a day to move or a day to stay alive by not moving at all. And that is where tonight's winter truly begins. Not in a grand storm, but in the quiet space between a man's hand and a frozen piece of leather, while the dark mountains wait to see whether he has learned enough small lessons to earn one more morning. The first mercy of that morning is that he does not rush. A hurried man in winter can ruin himself very quietly. He can step too soon into half-warmed footwear, crack the leather, tear a seam, blister his heel, and spend the next 3 days learning how large a small injury can become when every mile is made of cold ground. So he waits by the coals, working the moccasin in his hands, listening to the horse shift in the dark, and letting the camp come back to life one reluctant sound at a time. This is the part of mountain man survival that later stories often skip, because it does not look very heroic. It looks like maintenance. It looks like checking a strap. It looks like shaking frost from a blanket. It looks like saving the dry part of a powder horn as if it were a little private kingdom. It looks like one man noticing that another man has gone too long without eating properly and is starting to make decisions with that thin, angry brightness hunger gives people. The winter of 1836, if we hold the title carefully, sits inside a bigger machine. The rendezvous that summer near the Green River did not simply appear because trappers enjoyed camping with a crowd. It was a solution to distance. Instead of hauling every pelt all the way back to St. Louis, companies and traders brought goods west, and trappers brought furs to a chosen meeting place. For a short time, the mountains became a store, a tavern, a court of reputation, a rumour mill, and sometimes a very expensive mistake wearing a blanket coat. A trapper might arrive with beaver skins, debts, expectations, and a strong belief that he deserved something better than the last few months had given him. At Rendezvous, he could trade for powder, lead, knives, traps, awls, blankets, shirts, tobacco, coffee, beads, kettles, and alcohol when it was present, which it often was, and which did not improve everyone's planning skills. The practical goods mattered most after the noise faded. A blanket bought in July could decide a night in December. A poor choice made while a man was feeling rich could follow him into snow. That is one of the quiet jokes of the fur trade. Summer was where men performed independence. Winter was where the account came due. The bill did not always arrive on paper. Sometimes it arrived as an empty pouch of powder. Sometimes as a horse too thin to carry what it had carried before. Sometimes as a man looking at his last bit of tobacco and realizing that comfort had been purchased before necessity, which is a very human mistake and a terrible business plan at 10 below. Before the deep cold, the wise survivor had to think backward from winter. He needed enough ammunition to hunt, but also enough restraint not to waste it. He needed traps in working order, but a trap was only useful if he could reach water, set it, check it, and keep himself alive while doing so. He needed clothing that could be repaired, not just admired. He needed a knife that stayed with him as closely as a thought. He needed fire-making supplies kept dry. He needed food, or a plan for finding food. And the plan had to be more reliable than confidence. Confidence is useful until the weather asks for a receipt. The country itself forced planning into the body. High valleys could offer shelter, but shelter could also trap cold air. River bottoms could mean water and animals, but also dampness, fog, ice, and brush that caught at clothing. Timber could save a camp with fuel and windbreaks, yet timber also hid movement and made travel slower. Open ground could show a clear route and also expose a man to wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A mountain man did not survive by liking nature. He survived by reading the places where nature was about to become paperwork. And then there were the animals. A horse or mule was not a prop in this story. It was storage, transportation, social status, escape plan, and sometimes the difference between bringing meat back or staring sadly at where meat might have been. In winter, animals needed grazing or stored feed, and in much of the trapping country, stored feed was not something a man simply had waiting in a barn. Snow crust could hide grass. Ice could make footing dangerous. A weak animal slowed a party. And a slow party could miss a window of weather. And a missed window could become a camp no one wanted. So after the moccasins come the animals. The man steps out, perhaps into snow, with a crust that breaks just enough to be annoying, and checks what the night has done. He may run a hand along a horse's neck, feel for heat, look at the ribs, notice whether the animal is dull-eyed, restless, or still strong enough for work. This is not tenderness in the modern sentimental sense, though tenderness could exist. It is practical attention. If the horse fails, the man's world shrinks to what he can carry on his back. A party might choose to stay near a wintering place where game, wood, and shelter seemed possible, but staying also meant using up what was close. Hunting pressure could push animals away. Men needed meat, but gunshots cost powder and lead. Traps needed tending, but tending them cost time, warmth, and risk. The work did not stop because the temperature dropped. It only became slower and less forgiving. Food made the clearest argument. Fresh meat was valuable, but it was not guaranteed. Dried meat or cached supplies could help, but caches could fail, be found, spoil, freeze into difficulty, or simply run short. A man who had eaten well at rendezvous might later discover that the body remembers feasts in the least helpful way possible. Hunger simplified personality. It made tempers shorter. It made small unfairness large. It made the idea of moving camp sound both necessary and impossible. In this world, native knowledge and trade were not decorative background. They were often central to survival, though many later mountain man legends pushed them to the edge of the frame. Indigenous communities knew seasons, routes, plants, animals, weather signs, and the politics of movement through country that newcomers often misunderstood. Relationships could mean trade, kinship, alliance, tension, violence, or fragile negotiation, depending on people, place, and moment. The responsible story cannot turn native people into magical helpers, and it cannot erase them either. The fur trade was a contact zone, and winter made every relationship more serious. The sources are uneven here. Journals and later recollections often favour the man with the pen, the man who survived, or the man whose story became useful afterward. A dead trapper's bad decision might vanish into a line about hardship. A native woman's labour might appear only as a passing note, though her knowledge, food work, language, and family ties could shape whether a camp functioned at all. The record remembers adventure more easily than maintenance. Winter, unfortunately, was mostly maintenance. Back at the fire, the moccasins are finally warm enough. The man has checked the horse, judged the sky, felt the hunger in his stomach, and listened for the sounds that tell him whether camp is steady or beginning to fray. The first lesson of survival is already clear. Winter did not begin when snow fell. It began months earlier, in every trade, every repair, every debt, every animal fed or neglected, every dry spark protected, and every careless summer choice now sitting beside him in the cold. The cold does not leave him when he stands. It follows him into the clothing, into every seam, into the small spaces where warmth should have stayed, if the world were designed by someone kinder. The moccasins are on now, but that only means the next problem has permission to arrive. He can move, yes, but movement creates sweat. Sweat becomes dampness. Dampness becomes cold, and cold has a patient way of turning yesterday's clever clothing into today's argument. This is where the old buckskin image needs a little damage. Buckskin could be tough, flexible, useful, and beautifully suited to many kinds of travel when cared for properly. It was also not a magic winter uniform. Leather could stiffen, seams could fail, wet clothing could cling. A fringe might help water run off in some conditions, but it could not negotiate peace with a storm. The famous mountain man outfit was not invincible. It was a repair project with sleeves. A man in 1836 trapping country might wear a hunting shirt, leggings, moccasins, blankets, wool pieces if he had them, a cap or hat, mittens when fortune and planning allowed, and whatever else trade, repair, or desperation had placed in his hands. Some clothing came from trade goods, some came from animal skins, some was copied, adapted, purchased, patched, borrowed, or worn past the point where dignity had much influence. The best outfit was not the one that looked most rugged by a campfire. It was the one still working at dawn. Clothing survival begins with layers, but layers in this world were not a modern gear system with clean labels and clever fabric. A layer was a shirt that had already seen too much smoke. A layer was a blanket belted around the body because there was no better answer. A layer was fur, hide, wool, or cloth that carried smell, grease, ash, sweat, and the memory of every night it had not quite dried. If a man could keep one piece reasonably dry, that piece became more precious than many speeches about courage. The body made its own weather inside the clothes. Walk too hard through snow, climb too fast, carry too much, or chop wood in a hurry, and warmth turned against you. Sweat collected under hide and cloth. Then the work stopped. The wind found you, and your own effort began cooling you from the inside. This unfair trick punishes both laziness and enthusiasm, leaving the mountain man with the boring middle path of knowing how much effort he can afford. That middle path was learnt the slow way. A newer man might overdress while walking, then shiver when he stopped. An experienced man might open a garment before he overheated, slow his pace before sweat soaked him, or stop earlier than pride preferred, because daylight and dry clothing mattered more than reaching a dramatic ridge. The country taught through consequences. It did not give lectures. It let your shirt freeze and trusted you to understand. By the fire, repair work was constant. A tear in leggings might be only a nuisance in summer. In winter, it was an invitation. A broken moccasin seam could change the day's travel. A lost mitten could make a hand useless enough to slow loading, shooting, cutting, and eating. An awl, sinew, thread, spare leather, a needle, or a strip cut from something else could become the quiet hero of the camp. The man who could mend quickly owned a kind of wealth that did not shine. Picture him sitting on a log or a roll of bedding, holding a strip of hide close to the firelight, trying to push a needle through stubborn material while his fingers resist being fingers. The smoke moves into his eyes. Someone nearby coughs. A horse stamps. The fire snaps and throws a brief red light over the broken edge of a moccasin. No one writes a ballad about this, which is probably for the best. But this may be the moment that decides whether tomorrow can happen properly. The blankets deserve their own respect. A good blanket was warmth, bedding, coat, trade item, shelter piece, and sometimes the difference between sleep and long hours of shaking in the dark. Wool blankets were major trade goods in the fur trade world, and they carried real value because they solved a real problem imperfectly but repeatedly. A wet blanket, however, was a heavy moral lesson. It could hold water, smoke, smell, and cold with dedication. Keeping bedding dry was not a small domestic preference. It was survival management. A man might spread a blanket near heat, but too close and sparks could damage it. Too far and it stayed damp. Fold it wrong and the wet side found the dry side. Pack it badly and snow crept into it. Sleep on the wrong ground and moisture rose into it from below. Everything wanted to become damp. Dampness was the quiet enemy, sitting beside the more obvious enemy called freezing. Shelter helped, but shelter also had limits. A brush lean-to, hide cover, tent when available, lodge through trade or family connection, natural windbreak, grove of timber, cut bank, or hollow out of the wind could all matter. But shelter was never just shelter. It asked where smoke would go, where animals could graze, where water could be reached, where snow would drift, and how far a tired man would have to walk before morning. So clothing and shelter tied the man back into the whole system. His coat depended on trade, his moccasins depended on material and repair, his blanket depended on rendezvous goods, company credit, native exchange, or earlier planning. His fire depended on wood and time. His sleeping place depended on animals, water, wind, and the social politics of camp. A single cold body was really a bundle of relationships, each one tested by weather. There is also a class difference hiding inside the cold. A better supplied trader, guide, or company man might have access to stronger goods, more spare items, or companions who could share labour. A poorly supplied free trapper might carry more risk on his own skin. One man might have an extra blanket, another might have a story about how he meant to get one. The cold listened politely to both men and favoured the one with the blanket. And gender appears here too, though many mountain man legends pretend the camps were made only of men, and whether, in fur trade households and mixed communities, native women and women of mixed descent often made, repaired, processed, packed, traded, translated, and sustained the material life that allowed men to appear independent later. Clothing did not repair itself because a bearded man looked noble in it. Robes were prepared, hides worked, seams sewn, food processed, relations managed. The romance of the lone trapper often stands on labour the story forgets to mention. The man by the fire may not say any of this out loud. He only feels the problem in practical pieces. His sleeve is damp. His blanket edge is scorched. His moccasin seam needs work. His horse needs checking again. The sky is pale now, and the camp is becoming visible. Smoke, stiff blankets, half-awake men, animals nosing poor grass, packs slumped like tired bodies. The morning has not become easier, it has only become clearer. He stands carefully, not because the scene is dramatic, but because everything on him has to keep working. The clothing holds what warmth it can. The repaired seam holds for now. The blanket dries slowly in smoke. The winter waits outside the circle of camp, ready to test the next weak place. And the next weak place is almost always smaller than a legend wants it to be. The next weak place is the stomach. It waits quietly at first, letting the cold take all the attention. Then it begins making suggestions. A hungry man hears the world differently. The crack of a twig becomes possible meat. The sight of another man's pouch becomes a small moral test. The smell of anything cooking, even something tough and half-burned, can feel almost rude in its power. In a Rocky Mountain winter, food was not a background detail. Food was the clock, the argument, the distance a man could travel, and the mood of the whole camp. The easy legend says mountain men hunted and lived off the land. There is truth inside that, but the phrase is dangerously tidy. Living off the land sounds like the land has agreed to be lived off. It had not. Game moved. Snow covered tracks. Storms closed visibility. Powder had to stay dry. Lead had to be saved. A shot could miss. A wounded animal could vanish into timber. A successful kill could happen too far from camp, leaving men with the tiring problem of turning a dead animal into usable food before cold, darkness, wolves, or exhaustion claimed their share. So food survival began before hunger. It began with knowing where animals might winter, where valleys held grazing, where streams opened enough for movement, where elk, deer, bison in some regions, or smaller game might be found. It began with understanding that a place good for trapping beaver was not automatically good for feeding men. A trapline could pull a man toward water, but winter meat might be somewhere else. The body wanted calories. The trade wanted pelts. The weather did not care which business plan was more elegant. Picture a small hunting party leaving camp after the sky has lifted just enough to show the ridges. They carry rifles carefully, because a firearm in this country is not just a weapon. It is a food tool, a confidence tool, a trade object, and, if handled badly, a very expensive stick. The powder horn must be protected from damp. The lock must be kept as dry as possible. The hands must work when called upon. A man might be hungry, but hunger does not make fingers steadier. The hunt itself could be less dramatic than the paintings suggest. Much of it was waiting, reading sign, moving slowly, stopping too often, and feeling the cold creep through the places clothing had promised to defend. Tracks could be old, droppings could tell a story that ended yesterday. A ridge might offer a view and also steal heat through wind. The hunter had to decide whether to keep going, turn back, split the party, or risk one more slope. History rarely shows the part where a man becomes lost because lunch sounded possible. If they found meat, the victory immediately became labour. An animal had to be butchered. The hide might be useful. The meat had to be carried, dragged, packed, dried, frozen, guarded, or eaten, before waste made the success smaller. In deep cold, freezing could preserve meat, but frozen meat still had to be cut, cooked, thawed, or gnawed into usefulness. A carcass in the wrong place was not food yet. It was a project lying in the snow. Back in camp, the cooking was simple, because winter had no patience for decoration. Meat might go into a kettle if a kettle was available. It might be roasted, boiled, dried, or cut into strips. Fat mattered deeply. Lean meat could fill the mouth and still leave the body asking for more. Fat carried warmth in a way men understood long before nutrition charts arrived to make the obvious official. A scrap of fat could change the mood of a meal. A pot with grease in it could become the centre of attention with almost royal authority. This is one reason starvation in fur trade country did not always look like an empty landscape. A man could eat and still be underfed. He could chew tough meat and still lack what his body needed for cold, labour, and repair. He could feel full for an hour and weak by afternoon. The body does not accept heroic storytelling as nourishment, which is disappointing given how much of it later got written. Caches were supposed to solve some of this. Meat or supplies could be hidden or stored for later, placed where men hoped they could return. But a cache was really a promise made to a future day, and winter enjoyed breaking promises. Animals might find it. Other people might find it. Weather might change the route back to it. A man might misremember the marker, or snow might erase what memory needed. Food left behind was comfort only if the world allowed you to meet it again. There is a quiet scene here that belongs more to survival than any gunshot. A man kneels beside a cache spot, brushing snow with stiff hands, looking for a sign he trusted weeks earlier. Maybe it is a bent branch, a stone, a notch, a shape in the ground. In summer, it would seem obvious. Under snow, every little mark looks less certain. The others wait behind him, pretending not to worry too loudly. The stomach makes everyone a poor philosopher. Food also shaped the social weather of camp. A generous man with meat gained warmth beyond the fire. A man who hid food might survive physically and damage himself socially. Sharing could be moral, practical, strategic, or expected, depending on the group and the moment. In a company brigade, supplies and rules might be more organised, though not always kinder. Among free trappers, independence still had to negotiate with hunger. No one is fully independent when someone else has the only kettle with meat in it. Native trade and knowledge again mattered here, and it must be handled without turning people into scenery. Indigenous communities had their own food systems, seasonal movements, storage practices, hunting knowledge, and political concerns. Trade with trappers could bring goods and pressure at the same time. Food might be exchanged, taught, withheld, shared through kinship, or contested through conflict. The fur trade created relationships where hunger, diplomacy, marriage, debt, and suspicion could all sit around the same fire. The written record often makes food appear when it becomes a problem. Full stomachs leave fewer dramatic lines. Hunger, scarcity, desperate travel, dead horses, failed hunts, and thin men get remembered because they interrupt the story. That means the archive can exaggerate crisis by preserving the loudest moments, while also hiding ordinary labour that prevented crisis. Women processing food, people gathering fuel, someone repairing a kettle, someone knowing which valley still held animals. These acts may disappear because they worked. By afternoon, the camp may smell of boiled meat, wet wool, horse sweat, and smoke pressed low by cold air. A man eats with the attention of someone who knows the meal is not only a meal. It is tomorrow's strength. It is patience restored. It is one less argument. It is the ability to mend a seam without shaking, to walk without making foolish choices, to sleep without the body waking in alarm. But the pot empties. The fire lowers. The horses still need forage. The trapline still pulls at the day. The repaired moccasin still has to carry weight over snow. The winter has not been defeated by dinner. It has only been postponed. One mouthful at a time. And the man understands, as the last grease shines in the bottom of the kettle, that hunger is never far from returning with better questions. The empty kettle leaves its own kind of sound. Not loud. More like the way men stop looking at the fire and begin looking toward the animals. Food has brought a little strength, but strength has to move on legs. And in the winter mountains, the most important legs in camp may not belong to a man at all. They belong to the horse standing with its head low, or the mule nosing through snow for poor grass, or the pack animal whose ribs are too easy to count. A man could boast about independence. His horse knew the truth. The animal carried traps, robes, blankets, ammunition, spare clothing, kettles, tools, trade goods, sometimes meat, sometimes a man too tired or injured to walk. It made distance possible. It made return possible. It made escape possible if a situation turned dangerous. Without it, the wide country became suddenly larger, and the man became smaller in a practical way. Winter survival was never only about the human body. It was about keeping the animal body alive too. A horse did not eat legend. A mule did not thrive on confidence. They needed grass, browse, rest, water, and enough luck to avoid injury. Snow could hide feed. A hard crust could make grazing difficult. Ice could cut or slip. A storm could scatter animals or trap them in a place where every hour made them weaker. The camp's future could stand quietly on 4 cold legs and say nothing. So after a meal, men might check hobbles, ropes, loads, sores, and signs of animal trouble. A rubbed back from a bad pack could become serious. A loose shoe or injured hoof could slow everything. A horse that strayed in the night might cost half a day, and half a day in winter was not a small amount of time. It was daylight, heat, food, and patience spent looking for the thing that was supposed to help you survive. There was a kind of camp anxiety that belongs only to people who depend on animals. A man wakes and listens. Not for wolves first, not for weather. He listens for the bell on a horse, the faint movement of a picketed animal, the ordinary noises that prove the camp has not lost its engine while men slept. Silence can be peaceful in a poem. In a winter camp, silence can also mean someone is about to put on frozen moccasins and go searching before breakfast, which history should have filed under unnecessary paperwork. Pack animals also shape decisions before anyone admitted the animals were making the decisions. If the party had strong animals, it could move more goods, carry more meat, and take a harder route if needed. If the animals were weak, the men might abandon gear, shorten travel, stay in a poor camp too long, or split the load in ways that created arguments. A trap, a blanket, a kettle, a robe, a bag of lead, a little coffee, a spare shirt, each object had weight. The horse turned possessions into choices. The weight mattered because the fur trade created strange priorities. Pelts were the reason many men were in the mountains, but pelts were not edible. Beaver skins could become money, credit, trade goods, reputation, debt payment, but in a bad winter, they were also bundles that had to be moved. A man could be rich in something that did not warm him tonight, unless he could convert it into what winter demanded. The whole trade depended on turning animal labour, human labour, and distant fashion into value. The horse stood in the middle of that equation, chewing whatever grass it could find. Company structures made this clearer. A brigade was not just a row of romantic figures riding through snow. It was an organised movement of people, animals, goods, and obligations. Someone had to think about routes, pasturage, camp placement, loads, and timing. Free trappers had more personal choice, but choice did not remove logistics. It only made the consequences more private. Either way, the animal had a vote, and the vote was counted in speed, strength, and survival. Picture a man kneeling beside a pack saddle in grey morning light. His hands are still sore from cold. He checks a strap stiffened by frost. If he pulls too hard, it may crack or break. If he leaves it loose, the load may shift and rub the animal raw. If the animal is rubbed raw, it may weaken. If it weakens, the party loses time. If the party loses time, a pass may close, a storm may catch them, or a valley they hoped to reach before dark may remain only a line in someone else's memory. That is the mountain version of bureaucracy. One strap becomes a weather problem. The animals also changed the social order of camp. The man with extra mounts held a kind of insurance. The man who had lost an animal might have to ask, trade, borrow, walk, or abandon property. A tired group could become less generous when every spare animal was already carrying more than it should. Kindness existed, but so did calculation. A loaned horse was not only a favour, it was risk transferred, with hooves underneath. Native trade networks and horse cultures were crucial in this world, especially across the plains and mountain west, but the details varied widely by nation, region, and relationship. Horses were wealth, mobility, diplomacy, and sometimes conflict. Trappers bought, traded, borrowed, lost, stole, recovered, and depended on animals within a world where indigenous communities had their own political and economic stakes. A careful story cannot pretend the mountain man invented mobility in a landscape already full of skilled travellers. He entered systems that were older, smarter, and more complicated than his legend admits. When winter tightened, animal death could become a brutal turning point. The loss might be from cold, hunger, accident, exhaustion, theft, or conflict. The exact circumstances mattered, and the sources do not always give them clearly, but the consequence is easy to understand. Lose one horse, and everything carried by that horse has to go somewhere. Onto another animal, making it weaker. Onto a man's back, making him slower. Into the snow, becoming an offering to necessity. Survival often means deciding which useful thing must be left behind because another useful thing has failed. That decision could be heartbreaking in a very plain way. A trap left behind was future income gone. A blanket left behind was warmth gone. A kettle left behind was cooking made harder. A robe left behind was value abandoned. A man might joke while doing it, because jokes are sometimes how people keep from swearing until the mountains learn new words. But the joke would not make the load lighter by much. By evening, the animals gathered near camp become part of the soundscape of survival. Breath, stamping, rope creak, the occasional dull thud of a hoof, a bell if one is used, a man muttering while checking a knot. The fire warms human hands, but the larger question stands just beyond it. Can the horses make another day? Can the mules carry another load? Can the camp move before the next weather turns the route from difficult into closed? The man with the repaired moccasin understands this as he watches his horse lower its head again into the snow-scraped grass. His own hunger matters. His own cold matters. But the animal's strength is now part of his body, extended outward into the dark. If the horse fails, winter reaches him faster. So he listens through the night, not only for wind, not only for wolves, but for the quiet proof that the living engine of the camp is still there. Breathing. The horse is still breathing beyond the firelight, and that is good news. But the fire itself is already asking to be paid again. It has burned through the easy wood. The coals glow low, red under ash, giving just enough light to show the camp what it wants, and not enough heat to solve anything for free. A man can stare at a fire as if warmth is a natural right, but in winter country, warmth is work, wearing orange light. Someone has to feed it. Someone has to choose the wood. Someone has to drag branches through snow, break deadfall, split what can be split, save what should not be wasted, and keep the flame alive without turning the shelter into a smoke box. This is another place where the legend becomes smaller and more interesting. A mountain man did not survive because he simply made a fire. He survived because he understood what kind of fire was needed, where it should sit, how much fuel it would cost, and when comfort was stealing tomorrow's labour. Fire was heat, but it was also a tool. It softened frozen moccasins. It dried a blanket, slowly and badly. It made meat edible, or at least less hostile. It thawed fingers enough to mend a seam. It helped keep damp powder from becoming useless, though too much heat near powder created a different and more exciting problem, the kind no one needs during breakfast. It gave light to repair work. It shaped the circle where men talked, argued, watched, and decided whether the camp still trusted itself. But fire depended on place. A camp near timber had fuel close by, which mattered when the body was tired and daylight short. Yet timber could mean deep snow under branches, hidden ice, poor sightlines, or animals tucked where men had to work harder to find them. A camp in an open valley might offer better grazing and a clearer view, but the wind could take the heat as soon as it rose. A riverbank might give water and cottonwood, but also damp air, slippery edges, and cold that settled low, like it had been invited. So the campfire was really a map decision. Put it to exposed, and men wasted wood fighting wind. Put it too enclosed, and smoke punished everyone under the shelter. Put it too far from animals, and checking them became colder work. Put it too near packs, and sparks threatened blankets, hides, and trade goods. Every placement solved one problem while quietly creating another. History, again, was not short on meetings that could have been emails, except the email was smoke in your eyes. Smoke was part of the bargain. It could preserve, dry, sting, blacken, and annoy with equal commitment. A man sleeping near a poor fire might wake with eyes burning, throat raw, hair and clothing carrying the smell so deeply that he seemed less like a person than a message from a chimney. Yet smoke could also help dry things, keep insects away in warmer seasons, and mark human presence in a landscape where being found could mean help, trouble, trade, or danger, depending on who saw it and why. In winter, the smoke often hung low when cold air trapped it. It drifted through brush shelters, into blankets, around faces. A man might shift closer for heat, then away for air, then closer again because cold is very persuasive. He might turn his blanket, lift his head, cough, mutter something about the fire as if the fire had personal flaws, and then forgive it because the alternative was worse. Gathering fuel could become a social task, and social tasks reveal a camp. Who goes out? Who stays near the animals? Who is too tired? Who avoids work? Who notices? In a small party, laziness has less room to hide than it does in a town. A man who never brings wood but always enjoys the flame may discover that winter makes reputations efficiently. The cold does not need gossip, but people do, and a camp can become very interested in fairness when everyone is uncomfortable. The work was also dangerous in plain ways. A man cutting wood with numb hands could slip. An axe or knife did not become safer because the scenery was beautiful. Dragging branches through snow burned energy. Moving away from camp in low light risked losing direction, especially in storm, timber, or uneven ground. Even a short errand could stretch if the first deadwood was too wet, too buried, too green, or too heavy. Firewood sounds humble until you are tired enough to understand it as distance. The quality of fuel mattered. Dry wood was a blessing. Green wood sulked, smoked, and reminded everyone that nature has a sense of humour, but not a kind one. Dung could be used as fuel in some treeless regions and periods, including by travellers across the plains, though for mountain winter camps, the exact fuel choices depended heavily on place. Brush, deadfall, driftwood, roots, whatever would burn, each meant a different kind of flame and a different kind of complaint. Fire also drew the camp into order. Around it, tools came out. A knife blade caught the light. A strip of leather softened. A kettle leaned close. Someone checked a rifle lock. Someone lifted a blanket to see whether the damp edge had improved or merely warmed its wetness, which is not the same achievement. Men could speak more softly near fire because faces became visible. Suspicion, humour, fatigue, hunger, and planning all sat within the same orange circle. The sources often mention fire only when it fails, when cold becomes severe, when camps are desperate, or when a dramatic night enters memory. Ordinary successful fires vanish because they worked. That is one of the strange unfairnesses of history. The tasks that kept people alive are often too routine to be recorded, while the disasters get all the attention. A dry night by a well-managed fire may leave no line in a journal. A frozen night after bad judgment may become a story. This silence matters because the work of warmth was not always done by the famous man later placed at the centre of the tale. In broader fur trade camps and households, women often processed hides, cooked, repaired clothing, managed food, tended children, and did forms of domestic labour that made survival possible while later stories focused on male adventure. Fire sat at the centre of that labour too. It cooked, dried, softened, smoked, warmed, and demanded attention from whoever had the responsibility to keep a household or camp functioning. By late evening, the fire has become smaller again. It always does. A man can delay the dark, but he cannot cancel it. He decides how much wood to spend before sleep, how close to lie, which side of the blanket is driest, whether the sparks are safe, whether the horse needs one more check, whether the sky has cleared too sharply, promising a bitter night. He pushes one more branch into the coals and watches the flame take it slowly. The repaired moccasin rests near his feet, not too close now. The blanket holds smoke and a little warmth. The animal breathes beyond the light. The kettle is empty. The camp is quiet in the way camps become quiet when everyone is listening to the same weather. Fire has not conquered the winter. It has only opened a small room inside it. A room made of wood, ash, patience, and the knowledge that someone will have to rise before dawn and pay for warmth all over again. Before dawn, the small room made by the fire begins to collapse. The heat has thinned, the blanket has cooled. The horse beyond the light is still alive, but the day is already asking its next question. Do they stay, or do they move? That question could save a man, or ruin him. Staying might conserve strength, protect animals, and wait out weather. Staying might also burn nearby wood, empty the last easy food, and trap the party in a place that looked safe yesterday and foolish tomorrow. Moving might reach better grass, better hunting, lower ground, timber, water, or a known trail. Moving might also put tired men into wind, ice, river crossings, white ground, and the quiet confusion that makes distance lie. A mountain man did not need a grand catastrophe to get into trouble. He needed one wrong guess about weather, one river that looked crossable, one slope that seemed shorter than it was, one shortcut chosen because everyone was tired of being sensible. Winter is excellent at punishing shortcuts. It waits until a man has almost convinced himself he is clever, then adds snow. So the camp wakes into calculation. The moccasins are warmed again. The blankets are shaken. Packs are tightened. The horses checked, loaded, and judged. Men look at the sky because the sky is the oldest written notice in camp, though it does not use friendly language. A clear morning can be good travel. It can also mean sharp, cold. A soft grey sky can hold steady. It can also thicken into a storm. Clouds over ridges may be warning, decoration, or both. The mountain rarely explains itself. The first danger of travel is not always getting lost. Sometimes it is believing you are not lost yet. In broken mountain country, a familiar ridge can appear strange under snow. A creek can vanish under ice or snow crust. A trail used in summer can become blocked, wind-scoured, drifted, or simply harder to read. Landmarks shrink when weather lowers visibility. The world becomes fewer shapes: dark timber, pale slope, grey sky, black water, and the long line of men and animals trying to remain a line. Rivers and streams were especially good at humiliating confidence. Ice might hold a man and fail under an animal. A snow bridge might hide water beneath. Wet feet could become more dangerous than an empty stomach for the next few hours. Wet packs meant heavier loads, damp blankets, threatened powder, and another evening spent trying to dry things that did not want to dry. A man could cross successfully and still pay for it all night. Picture a party standing at a creek edge. The water is not large enough to deserve a legend, which makes it more dangerous in its own way. It slides black under crusted ice, making soft sounds that suggest depth without giving measurements. One man tests the edge with a pole. Another holds a horse that does not like the proposal. Someone says they crossed worse last year. The cold waits beneath the surface, very patient. If they cross, they do it carefully, because care is cheaper than rescue. Loads may be adjusted. Men may look for a narrower place, a shallower place, a place with brush for footing, a place where the bank will not crumble. Even then, an animal can slip. A pack can shift. A man can go into the knee, the waist. Suddenly the whole day becomes about drying, warming, repacking, calming the horse, and pretending no one is thinking about how close ordinary water came to becoming disaster. Snow itself could change the meaning of distance. A mile through dry summer ground is not the same mile through crusted snow, soft drifts, hidden rocks, and cold wind. Men broke trail, animals sank, loads dragged, feet hurt in new ways. The slowest person or weakest animal decided the pace, and the pace decided where dark would find them. A map might say the next good camp was reachable. The snow might disagree, and the snow had stronger local authority. There was also the problem of daylight. Winter days were short, and short days made every argument sharper. Leaving late could be costly. Stopping late could be worse. A party that pushed past the proper camp because better ground seemed just ahead might end in darkness. Trying to place a fire, find fuel, tend animals, and cook with hands that no longer wanted tasks. That is when mistakes multiply. A strap is tied poorly. A blanket is dropped in snow. A horse is not checked well. A pot tips. A man snaps at another man, not because the insult matters, but because fatigue has become the camp's loudest member. The social order of travel could tighten under that pressure. A leader had to be obeyed enough for the group to move. Men who liked independence still had to follow timing, route, and camp decisions if they wanted the advantages of traveling together. A reckless man endangered others. A slow man frustrated them. An injured man forced choices that could reveal whether the party valued loyalty, profit, speed, or survival most. The trail turned character into logistics. The written sources tend to remember the dramatic crossings, the desperate marches, the violent encounters, the storms that proved worth describing. They do not always preserve the ordinary, correct decisions, the valley avoided, the pass delayed, the camp chosen early, the river not crossed. Yet those invisible decisions may have saved more lives than the famous bold ones. Survival often leaves no story because it prevented the story from becoming interesting. Native routes, place knowledge, and seasonal judgment mattered here as much as anywhere. Trails across the mountains were not blank inventions by newcomers with good cheekbones. They often followed older indigenous knowledge, animal paths, trade corridors, river systems, and generations of movement. Trappers learned, borrowed, ignored, misunderstood, and depended on that knowledge in uneven ways. Sometimes they travelled with guides. Sometimes they married into communities that changed what they knew. Sometimes they made bad choices, because pride is not a compass. By late afternoon, if the party has moved well, the new camp begins forming before dark. That is the best kind of victory in winter. Not spectacular, just early. Animals are unloaded while there is still light. A man finds wood before his fingers lose patience. Someone checks the wet edge of a blanket before it becomes a night problem. The kettle sits near the fire. The repaired moccasin, after miles of work, is inspected again like a small employee with a difficult job. If the day has gone badly, everything happens in the wrong order. Men arrive cold, hungry, and irritated. Animals stand too long under loads. Firewood is found late. The first flame struggles. Food waits. Wet clothing stays wet. Darkness hides the missing tool, the loose strap, the animal saw, the mood breaking. A bad route decision does not end when the walking stops. It follows the party into camp and takes a seat by the fire. So the winter road teaches a hard lesson, with no need for drama. Survival is not only what a man can endure, it is what he chooses early enough to avoid enduring. The mountains do not reward constant motion. They reward timing, humility, and the wisdom to stop before stopping is forced. As the new fire catches and the animals lower their heads in the fading light, the man understands that he has not crossed the day. He has only negotiated with it, and the day has agreed, for now, not to collect everything he owes. The new fire catches, and for a few minutes it lets everyone pretend the day has ended cleanly. Men set packs down, animals breathe in the dark. A kettle begins its slow argument with cold water. The repaired moccasin has held through another crossing of snow and frozen ground, which is not a triumph anyone would carve into a monument, but in this country, a seam that holds until evening deserves respect. By now, though, the shape of the story should be changing. At the beginning, it looked as if the winter was the enemy, and in a simple way, it was. Cold hurt, snow slowed movement, ice threatened feet, rivers, animals, and sleep. But the deeper danger was not only weather pressing against one man. The deeper danger was a whole moving system becoming fragile at once. A mountain man survived the winter when enough pieces of that system kept working together. The moccasin had to hold. The blanket had to dry. The fire had to burn. The horse had to graze. The rifle had to fire. The powder had to stay dry. The route had to remain readable. The meat had to appear, or the cash had to be found, or trade had to remain possible, or someone had to know a valley that still offered a chance. No single piece made him safe. Each piece merely delayed the moment when every other piece would be tested. That is the midpoint truth of this winter. The famous mountain man was less a lone conqueror of the Rockies than a walking bundle of dependencies. He depended on animals, trade goods, native knowledge, company routes, summer rendezvous, repaired clothing, remembered water, stored food, working metal, dry fire-making, group judgment, and the thin patience of weather. The legend gives him a rifle and a horizon. The winter gives him a checklist. And honestly, the checklist is more interesting, because once you see him this way, every ordinary object becomes charged with consequence. The powder horn is not only equipment, it is breakfast, protection, trade value, and future confidence in a curved container. A blanket is not cozy decoration, it is sleep, insulation, bargaining power, and the thing everyone notices if a man loses it. A horse is not background scenery, it is a moving warehouse with ears. A needle is not small, it is the difference between a tear and a ruined day. This is also where 1836 matters as more than a date placed on the title. The fur trade world of the mid-1830s was not at its fresh beginning. The rendezvous system still worked, but it was carrying strain. Beaver trapping had already pressured many waters. Competition had reshaped company behaviour. Global fashion, distant markets, and business decisions made in places far from the mountains affected men who would later wake up hungry beside a cold fire. The winter camp was connected to cities, hats, credit, transport, and trade prices, though none of those things helped much when a man was trying to thaw a strap with his hands. A trapper might feel far from civilization, but he was not outside economy. He was inside a long, cold version of it. Credit at rendezvous could become debt in camp. A poor trade could become a thin blanket. A shortage of ammunition could become fewer meals. A damaged trap could become lost income, which could become worse supplies next season, which could become more risk. The mountains looked empty, but obligation travelled well. The social meaning of survival changes here too. If the mountain man is a bundle of dependencies, then survival is not only personal skill, it is relationship. Who taught him where to go? Who traded with him? Who repaired what he wore? Who shared meat? Who watched the animals? Who knew the route? Who allowed passage? Who warned him about a storm pattern, a dangerous valley, a tense meeting, a band nearby, a river crossing best avoided? The later lone hero version often cuts those lines because lines of dependence make the hero less tidy. Winter did not care about tidiness. In a broader camp, the work of survival spread across people whose names rarely became famous. Someone processed food, someone mended, someone packed, someone interpreted language, someone knew kinship ties that made a meeting safer. Someone watched children in mixed families. Someone remembered which trade relationship had been damaged last season and should not be tested casually now. These are not side details. They are the quiet architecture under the dramatic man with the rifle. The sources make this difficult because they often preserve the story from the angle of men who travelled, trapped, fought, traded, wrote, or later remembered themselves. A journal might tell us that a party was hungry. It may not tell us who did the work that kept hunger from becoming worse. It might describe a cold march. It may not name the person who repaired the moccasin before that march became possible. The record gives us the flame when it flares. It often hides the hands that kept the coal alive. So the responsible version of this winter has to hold two truths at once. Mountain men did possess real skill, endurance, and local knowledge earned through hard experience. Some were remarkable travellers. Some endured frightening conditions. Some learned the country with extraordinary attention. And still, they were not separate from the world around them. They survived through networks as much as nerve. That does not make them less impressive. It makes them more human. A man who admits the cold is stronger than pride is already wiser than the one who poses against it. A man who learns from another people, repairs his gear, watches his horse, shares food when he can, and stops before the sky turns ugly, has understood something that a louder legend might miss. The Rockies did not reward the most dramatic man. They rewarded the one who made fewer fatal assumptions. By the fire, this truth would not sound like a speech. It would look like a man moving his blanket a little farther from the sparks. It would look like another man checking the horses before lying down. It would look like someone placing the powder where damp cannot easily find it. It would look like a small piece of meat saved for morning instead of eaten now. even though now is persuasive. The night deepens. The animals shift. Smoke drifts low and then lifts. Somewhere beyond camp, the route waits under snow. Not hostile in a personal way, but perfectly willing to become impossible. The man flexes his toes inside the repaired moccasin and understands, maybe without wording it, that survival is not one great act. It is a chain, and a chain does not fail because winter breaks every link. It only needs one link weak enough at the wrong moment. The weak link may be a strap, a horse, a wet powder horn, or a man's pride, but sometimes it is a relationship. In the fur trade mountains, relationships could keep a party alive as surely as meat or firewood. They could also place a party in danger when old debts, insults, fear, or competition came walking into camp before anyone had time to warm his hands. This is the part of the story that has to be handled carefully. The old mountain man legend often places native people at the edge of the frame, a guide who appears when needed, a trader with food, a threat on the horizon, a wife without much voice, a nameless band moving through the background while the bearded hero remains in the centre. That version is too easy. It is also false in the deeper sense, because the fur trade was not a one-man drama performed in empty country. It was a set of relationships moving through indigenous homelands. Long before the rendezvous system brought wagons, goods, missionaries and traders into the Green River country, native nations already knew routes, seasons, animal movements, water, fuel, winter shelter, danger zones, and the politics of passing through land that belonged to someone in memory, use, power, or claim. That knowledge was not decorative. It was infrastructure. It was a map carried in stories, hunting practice, kinship, trade, and ordinary movement. The trapper might know a valley because another man told him. That man might know it because a native guide showed him. The guide might know it because his people had used the route across generations. By the time the fact reached a later adventure story, the chain could become shortened into a sentence about a mountain man finding his way. History has a habit of making inherited knowledge look like individual instinct, which is flattering to the individual and very rude to everyone else. Winter made those relationships sharper. If a camp was hungry, trade mattered more. If a horse was weak, another route might matter more. If a storm closed a pass, local knowledge might become the difference between waiting in misery and moving toward a valley with wood, water, and game. If a party entered a tense area carelessly, misunderstanding could become fatal. The same landscape held cooperation, kinship, exchange, competition, and violence, sometimes very close together. There were native women in the fur trade world whose roles later legends often flatten. Some were wives or partners of trappers and traders. Some were translators, cultural mediators, food processors, hide workers, travellers, mothers, and organisers of daily survival. Their labour could turn a camp from a collection of hungry men into a functioning household or mobile community. A robe did not prepare itself. Meat did not dry itself. A relationship between two groups did not explain itself across language and custom. Someone had to do that work. This does not mean every relationship was gentle, equal, or safe. The fur trade carried disease, alcohol, competition, debt, violence, and pressure into indigenous worlds already facing their own political realities. Different nations had different experiences and choices. Some groups traded eagerly when it served their interests. Some controlled routes and resources with strength. Some negotiated, some resisted, some suffered from the changes the trade brought. A careful story must not turn native people into either background helpers or permanent victims. They were political actors in their own worlds. The mountain man standing near the fire might experience all of this in practical pieces. Who will trade? Who should be avoided? Which camp is friendly through marriage ties? Which rumour is dangerous? Which band has lost horses recently and may suspect outsiders? Which route crosses hunting grounds at the wrong time? Which man in his own party talks too loudly, drinks too much, or treats a delicate meeting like a campfire joke? In winter, bad manners could become a survival problem, which is one of history's more efficient teaching methods. Imagine a small trading moment near the edge of winter camp. The fire is low. A horse breathes behind one group. A kettle sits between people who do not share all the same language, but understand the value of what is being offered. Meat, powder, tobacco, robes, tools, news, horses, favors, promises, and suspicion may all be present, even if only a few objects are visible. Everyone is reading everyone. No one is simply scenery. For a tired trapper, such a meeting could feel like relief. Food might enter the camp. A better route might be described. News of weather, animals, or conflict might arrive. But relief could come with cost. Trade goods were finite. Promises mattered. A man who treated exchange like a one-sided rescue might discover that the world kept accounts, even when no clerk was sitting nearby. This is where the rendezvous world and the winter world meet. In summer, the Green River gathering could look loud, temporary, almost festive, with goods changing hands and stories multiplying. In winter, the same relationships became quieter and more serious. A blanket traded months earlier might warm a man now. A horse gained through exchange might carry his food now. A marriage tie might make travel possible now. A broken trust might close a door that could have opened towards safety. The written record does not preserve all of this evenly. Journals by trappers, missionaries, traders, and travelers often tell us what outsiders noticed, feared, wanted, or misunderstood. They may record a native group as helpful in one line and threatening in another, without explaining the deeper history behind either moment. They may name famous men and leave women unnamed. They may describe trade without showing the relationships that made trade possible. The silence is not empty. It is part of the evidence. So when we ask how mountain men survived the winter, one answer is, not alone. Even when they later remembered it that way. They survived through routes they did not invent, foods they did not always produce, clothing systems they learned and adapted, family ties they often failed to honor in their own stories, and trade networks that made the mountains less empty than the legend needed them to be. The man by the fire may still feel alone when the wind rises. His toes are still cold. His horse still needs grass. His stomach still watches the kettle with unreasonable hope. But around him, seen and unseen, are the human lines that made this camp possible. A trail learned from someone else. A hide worked by someone else's hands. A word translated across distrust. A warning remembered before a bad crossing. A trade made when both sides needed something. Outside the smoke, the mountains remain dark. The winter does not soften because people are connected. It only changes the terms of survival. The chain is longer now, running beyond the man's own gear, beyond the horse, beyond the fire, into other camps, other languages, other memories of the land. And if one link holds because someone else's knowledge was respected in time, the morning may arrive with the moccasin still repaired and the man still alive to put his foot inside it. The chain running beyond the fire also runs through obligation. A man can feel wonderfully free while riding through summer grass with a rifle across his lap and a blue line of mountains ahead of him. Winter has a way of asking who paid for the rifle, who supplied the powder, who owns the trap, who holds the debt, who expects the pelts, and who gets to decide where the party moves when the weather begins closing its fist. That is where the difference between free trappers and company men begins to matter. Though the line was not always as clean as later stories like to make it. A free trapper could sell to whom he wished, choose partners, take risks, and cultivate the valuable feeling that no clerk owned his mornings. But freedom in the mountains still had bills attached. He needed supplies, he needed animals, he needed ammunition, traps, blankets, tobacco, coffee if fortune smiled. And the boring little goods that kept a man from turning into a cautionary tale, if those came on credit. Independence had a shadow. A company man might have less freedom, but perhaps more structure. He could be tied to a brigade, a leader, a route, an account, a set of expectations, and a system that told him where to go and what his labour was supposed to become. That structure could feel like control, because it was. It could also reduce some risks by organising movement, supplies, and group labour. The company did not become a warm-hearted parent just because the snow fell. But in winter, organisation could be worth almost as much as courage. The old heroic version loves the free man because he looks better against a horizon. The company man looks too much like work. He is easier to overlook because he belongs to a system, and legends prefer men who appear to belong only to themselves. Yet the company man reveals something important. Mountain survival was not merely personality, it was management of goods, people, animals, time, credit, and risk. Think about a trap as an object. It is metal, weight, investment, and promise. If the trap belongs to the man, he carries its cost directly. If it belongs to a company or is supplied through credit, the cost follows him in another way. A broken trap means lost work. A lost trap means lost value. A trap left behind because a horse failed becomes a little piece of economy lying useless under snow. The trapper does not experience business as a chart. He experiences it as cold iron he has to carry. Debt worked like weather in this world. It might not be visible every morning, but it shaped the route. A man who owed for goods needed pelts. A man who needed pelts took risks to trap. A man taking risks in winter might travel when caution suggested waiting, set lines farther from camp, push animals harder, or remain in poor conditions because the season's work had to add up to something. Not every risky act came from recklessness. Sometimes it came from owing more than comfort could pay. There is a small scene for this. A man sits near the fire, turning over a damaged trap with his thumbs. One jaw is bent. The chain needs attention. His hands are stiff, and the light is poor. Across from him, another man is repairing a pack strap. No one has to say that every hour spent fixing gear is an hour not hunting, not resting, not sleeping, not moving toward better ground. The account is being kept in fatigue. Company discipline could bring its own pressure. A brigade needed coordination. Men might be expected to follow orders about camp, travel, trapping grounds, guard duty, animal care, movement. The man who disliked being told what to do might still understand that in winter, one disorganized man can make everyone colder. A pack loaded badly, a horse neglected, a fire left low, a night watch ignored, a route delayed by argument. Each act could tax the whole party. And yet discipline could become cruel if it valued pelts over bodies, speed over judgment, or authority over local knowledge. A leader with poor sense was more dangerous than weather in a hat. The best authority in winter was not loud. It noticed animals, food, clouds, tired hands, old trails, and the difference between bravery and waste. The worst authority confused motion with progress, which is a mistake that has harmed people in every century and several bad meetings. Free trappers had another kind of danger, the romance of their own choice. A small party might be flexible, quicker, and able to adapt without waiting for permission. It might also lack spare labour, spare animals, spare blankets, and spare patience. If one man fell ill, fewer people remained to hunt, gather wood, tend animals, and watch camp. If one horse failed, the loss hit harder. If two men quarrelled, the camp did not have many social cushions. Freedom could mean fewer people to disappoint, and fewer people to save you. Class and status moved quietly through these winter camps. A well-known trapper with good credit might get better terms at rendezvous. A man with a reputation for skill could attract partners. A man known for drinking away supplies, losing animals, or starting trouble might find fewer friends when the cold arrived. Reputation was a form of equipment. It did not warm the body directly, but it could open or close the human doors that led to food, credit, shelter, or help. The sources, again, remember reputation unevenly. Some men became famous because they survived long enough to be written about, told stories well enough to be repeated, or fit what later readers wanted a mountain man to be. Others appear as names, fragments, or not at all. A careful script cannot pretend that the famous represent the average. Famous survivors are not a random sample. They are the men whose link in the chain did not break loudly enough to erase them. In camp, the difference between free and company life might show itself in small gestures. Who decides when to move? Who owns the spare powder? Who has the right to use the best horse? Who gets blamed when meat runs low? Who must obey? Who can argue? And who has enough standing to be heard before a bad route becomes official? These things matter more than speeches about liberty. Winter cares less about a man's theory of freedom than about whether his party can make a decision before dark. By now, the man near the fire has learnt that survival is not only cold feet, hunger, animals, and firewood. It is also paperwork without paper, credit, reputation, duty, rank, promise, memory, debt. The account may be written in a trader's book somewhere, or it may be carried in the way other men look at him when supplies run short. The night settles around the camp again. A company man pulls his blanket close and listens for the leader's morning decision. A free trapper turns his damaged trap in the firelight and wonders whether one more day on the line is worth the weather coming over the ridge. Both men may imagine themselves differently. The winter sees the same question in each of them. What do you owe? What can you carry? And what will break first if the answer is wrong? What will break first is sometimes not a trap, a strap, or a promise. Sometimes it is the body itself, which has been politely sending warnings all along and is now tired of being ignored. The body in a winter camp is not a background character. It is the account book where cold, hunger, wet clothing, bad sleep, hard walking, smoke, fear, and poor food all write their entries. A mountain man could be skilled, experienced, and still lose a day to an ordinary injury. A cut hand, a twisted ankle, a burn from a careless moment near the fire, a bruised hip from a fall on ice, a toothache, a fever, sore eyes from smoke, cracked skin, swollen feet, or a cough that would not leave, could all become serious because the country did not pause for recovery. There was no warm clinic waiting beyond the next ridge. There was the next ridge. This is where winter turns small damage into command. A sore foot changes the pace. A damaged hand changes how well a man can load a rifle. Mend gear, cut meat, chop wood, tighten a pack, or hold reins. A fever changes judgment. Pain shortens patience. Smoke-stung eyes make travel harder. Weakness makes a man colder, because a weak body has less energy to produce heat and less will to do the boring tasks that keep heat possible. The famous mountain man body of later imagination is almost always strong. The real body was often tired, dirty, underfed, scratched, bitten in warmer seasons, smoke-cured, scarred, and asked to do too much with too little rest. It could endure a great deal, but endurance is not the same as invulnerability. History tends to admire the man who keeps going. Winter is more interested in the reason he probably should have stopped 2 miles ago. Cold injury was one of the clearest dangers, though we should avoid turning it into spectacle. Frostbite, numbness, and exposure were not dramatic special effects. They were quiet failures of warmth and blood. Fingers that lost feeling could not work properly. Feet that stayed wet and cold could become painful, clumsy, or worse. A man might not notice the full damage until later, because cold can dull pain before it announces the bill. That is a cruel arrangement. But winter has never been known for customer service. The prevention was mostly practical. Keep feet as dry as possible. Change or dry moccasins when you can. Protect hands. Do not sweat too much while working. Do not sit too long in damp clothing. Eat when there is food. Keep moving when movement helps. Stop when movement is making things worse. And learn the difficult difference. Warm slowly. Pay attention to the man who has stopped complaining, because silence can mean strength, but it can also mean he is sliding past the point where ordinary anger can keep him awake. Campmates mattered here. A man alone might miss his own decline, or deny it until the choice was gone. In a group, someone might notice a stumble, a grey face, a hand held strangely, a man too slow to rise. That attention could save him, though it could also irritate him deeply, because no one enjoys being told that his body has submitted a complaint. Still, in winter, Pride was often less useful than being watched by someone with sense. Medicine in the fur trade world was a mixed and uneven thing. Some men carried remedies, some relied on practical experience, indigenous knowledge, military or frontier medicine, trade items, household cures, or whatever seemed to have helped last time. There were herbs, poultices, bleeding in some medical traditions, purges, alcohol used unwisely or deliberately, and many confident ideas that modern medicine would not admire. But it would be unfair to make every past person into a fool. They worked with the knowledge, supplies, theories, and desperation available to them. What mattered most for many injuries was not heroic treatment, but conditions. Warmth, rest, food, cleanliness when possible, and time. Unfortunately, winter was stingy with all of those. Rest meant someone else had to gather wood, hunt, tend animals, set traps, cook, repair, stand watch, or carry more weight. An injured man became a social question. How much can the group absorb? How far can loyalty stretch? When does care become danger for everyone else? Picture a man sitting near the fire with one hand wrapped in a strip of cloth, trying to retie a knot with the other. He jokes badly about being twice as efficient now that he has half the working equipment. No one laughs very hard, because everyone can see the problem. The knot matters, the horse matters, the trapline matters. His hand matters because it belongs to him, and also because the camp needs it. Illness carried another kind of uncertainty. A cough could be smoke, cold air, fatigue, infection, or something worse. Stomach trouble could be bad food, stress, contaminated water, too much rich meat after hunger, or any number of causes men could not clearly diagnose. Fever in camp narrowed the world. A sick man needed warmth and water. He might need transport. He might slow travel. He might become delirious. The others had to decide whether to stay, move, divide labour, or pretend the problem was smaller than it was. The sources often mention illness when it becomes severe, but they do not always show the ordinary days of managing it. They may say a man was laid up, weakened, frozen, lame, or suffering, then move on because the journal had miles to cover. Pain rarely gets the paragraph space it deserves unless it changes the plot. That means we have to read carefully around the short lines. A brief note about a man unable to travel can hide a whole camp rearranged around one body. Native medical knowledge and frontier practice could overlap, clash, or be selectively borrowed, depending on people and relationships. Some plant knowledge, food knowledge, and bodily care came through indigenous communities, women, mixed households, and long experience in the region. Later stories often keep the dramatic wound and drop the quieter knowledge that treated it, which is a convenient way to make survival look more solitary than it was. By evening, the injured or sick man becomes part of the camp's weather, not because he is a burden in some cruel, simple sense, but because his condition changes every decision. The fire must be kept steadier. Food may be divided differently. The route may be delayed. An animal may carry less trade good and more human weakness. Someone may sleep lighter, listening for breathing near the coals. The man with the repaired moccasin understands this in his own feet, hands, and back. He knows that winter does not need to defeat him all at once. It can begin with a numb toe, a careless cut, a cough after too much smoke, a fall beside a creek, a fever that steals judgment. The mountains are made of stone and weather, but survival is made of flesh, and flesh has to be protected with humility. So before sleep, he checks the small pains. He flexes his fingers. He feels whether his feet are only cold or becoming something worse. He watches the others without making a speech about it. The fire gives a little light. The horses shift in the dark. Somewhere in the camp, a man coughs once, then again, and the sound hangs there longer than anyone wants it to. The cough hangs in the dark, and for a moment it becomes the kind of thing a journal might record, only if it worsens. If the man coughs twice, sleeps, wakes, and lives, the record may give him nothing. If the cough turns into fever, delay, fear, or death, then perhaps a line appears. That is one of the first rules of reading this world. The archive often notices ordinary suffering only when it becomes inconvenient to the journey. So before this winter moves toward its final lessons, we have to sit for a while with the evidence itself. Not in a stiff classroom way, more like holding a cold piece of metal near the fire and asking what shape it truly has. The mountain man past is full of journals, memoirs, company records, missionary accounts, government reports, later biographies, and campfire stories that grew longer every time a man found a willing listener. Some of those sources are valuable, some are vivid, some are careful in places and slippery in others. None of them should be treated like a window with perfectly clean glass. The men who wrote usually wrote from their own position. A trader noticed trade. A missionary noticed souls, habits, hardship, and moral meaning. A trapper might notice danger, hunger, roots, animals, weather, or the behavior of other men. A company record might notice goods, debts, pelts, losses, wages, and movement. Each kind of source tells the truth through its own doorway, and each doorway blocks part of the room. That matters because the title asks how mountain men survived the deadliest winter of 1836. The phrase is strong, and strong phrases are useful for attention, but history needs careful feet. We can speak about deadly winter conditions, dangerous travel, hunger, exposure, illness, and the harsh mountain world around 1836. We can place the story within the late rendezvous era and the fur trade system around the Green River and neighbouring ranges. But unless a source clearly supports a formal event called the Deadliest Winter of 1836, we should not pretend that the mountains kept a titled disaster on a shelf for us. This does not weaken the story. It makes it more honest. A winter does not need an official name to kill people. A man does not need to appear in a clean death count to have suffered. The danger may be real even when the label is modern, dramatic, or built from scattered evidence. The careful path is to show the winter system without inventing a neat catastrophe, just because a neat catastrophe is easier to package. Mountain man stories are especially vulnerable to inflation. A difficult march becomes a desperate march. A desperate march becomes nearly impossible. Nearly impossible becomes no man could have survived it. Except somehow the storyteller did, and he would be happy to explain after another drink. This is not because every old storyteller was a liar. It is because memory likes shape. Listeners like danger. Publishers like colour. Later readers like heroes. The wilderness becomes sharper in the retelling, and the man at the centre becomes larger, while the people who repaired, traded, guided, cooked, translated, and carried disappear into the snowbank behind him. There is humour in that, but only if we aim it at the legend, not at the suffering. A man who survived a terrible winter earned the right to sound impressed with himself. The problem begins when later versions turn survival into proof that one kind of man conquered a continent alone, which is convenient, dramatic, and about as reliable as a wet powder horn. The written sources also favour survivors. That sounds obvious, but it changes everything. The man who froze alone away from camp did not revise his memoir. The man whose horse failed and whose name no one carried east might appear only as a rumour, if at all. The woman whose labour helped keep a household functioning may be unnamed because the writer thought her work ordinary. The native guide whose route saved a party may be remembered as a brief mention, while the newcomer who followed it becomes the hero of the paragraph. Survival is loud in the archive. Prevention is quiet. Even weather itself can be hard to reconstruct. A journal might describe severe cold, deep snow, a frozen river, starving animals, or a storm that trapped a party. But exact temperature readings were not always present, consistent, or comparable. One man's terrible cold is another man's ordinary January, depending on location, exposure, clothing, hunger, wind, and memory. Snowfall in one valley does not prove conditions in another. A dangerous winter in the Snake River country may not match the same months near the Green River or farther south. The Rockies are not a single room, so the script has to use bounded language. In some camps, in certain valleys, for some trappers. According to later recollections, records suggest, it is safer to say, these phrases may sound less exciting than absolute certainty, but they let the listener trust the ground under the story. A sleep history script can still be vivid, without pretending to know what no one recorded. Picture a surviving journal page near a candle. A line says the weather was severe. Another line mentions hunger. Another names a river. Then the page moves on. Behind those few words are wet hands, horses scraping snow, men checking powder, a cough near the fire, a moccasin drying badly, someone deciding whether to move before the sky closes. The source gives us the nail heads, not the whole cabin. We have to build carefully around them without inventing polished walls. This caution also protects native history. Many fur trade sources describe native people through outsider fear, desire, trade interest, moral judgment, or misunderstanding. A tense encounter may be written as proof of danger without explaining previous trespass, theft, violence, insult, disease, or political pressure. A helpful exchange may be written as if generosity floated in from nowhere, without kinship, strategy, negotiation, or expectation. The record is not useless. It is alive with bias. And bias itself tells a story if we do not swallow its whole. By the fire, none of this would appear as a lecture. It would appear as uncertainty. A man hears a story about another party nearly starving. Did it happen exactly that way? Was the number right? Did the teller leave out his own mistake? Did someone else save him? Did the worst part grow in the telling? The camp listens anyway, because even an exaggerated story may carry a useful warning. Do not cross that pass too late. Do not trust that ice. Do not waste powder. Do not laugh at weather. The cough comes again. Someone shifts under a blanket. The fire settles. The record, if it ever mentions this night, may only say cold, hungry, delayed, sick, or moved camp. But we can hear the larger truth behind the short words. Survival in 1836 was not a single legend. It was a series of partly recorded negotiations between bodies, animals, supplies, native worlds, trade systems, weather, memory, and silence. And the silence is not empty. It is where many of the most important lives disappeared while keeping the famous story warm. The silence around those short journal lines opens into a wider silence too. The sound of an old business model beginning to lose its certainty. By the time our winter reaches the middle years of the 1830s, the Rocky Mountain fur trade is still alive, still noisy in summer, still capable of gathering men, animals, goods, and stories near the Green River. But it is no longer young in the same way. The system has weathered enough seasons to know its own weaknesses, and men in the mountains are beginning to feel pressure from forces they cannot see from camp. A trapper beside the fire may not talk about global fashion. He is more likely to talk about meat, horses, weather, debt, or the man who borrowed something and has developed a very poor memory about it. But the price of beaver, the demand for hats, company competition, changing routes, and the exhaustion of some trapping grounds all reach him eventually. They arrive as lower returns, tighter credit, longer searches, poorer country, sharper competition, and a growing sense that the old rhythm may not carry everyone much farther. This is what makes the late rendezvous world feel different from a simple wilderness tale. The man is not only surviving nature, he is surviving a market that asks him to keep pulling value out of cold country, even when the easy value has become harder to find. Beaver had once drawn men deep into the mountains with the promise of profit, but beaver streams could be trapped heavily. Good places became known. Rivals arrived. Animals were taken faster than they could easily replace themselves in many areas. The map of opportunity changed, and the man who depended on that map had to change with it, or suffer from yesterday's confidence. The winter camp shows this in ordinary objects. A worn trap near the fire is not only a tool, it is a question. Will the stream still pay? A thin pack of pelts is not only bad luck, it is debt waiting to become personal. A horse carrying fewer furs than expected still eats as much as a horse carrying plenty, which is one of the many ways animals refuse to respect economic disappointment. The kettle does not care whether beaver prices are falling, it still wants something in it. Rendezvous had solved one great problem of distance, but it created other temptations. Traders brought goods into the mountains, and trappers brought furs to them. For a little while, summer could feel like release. There were supplies, news, people, bargaining, boasting, alcohol in many accounts, marriages, disputes, repairs, and plans. A man could believe the next season would restore what the last one had damaged. Then the meeting broke apart, and every purchase became weight. Every debt became motive, and every promise had to be carried into weather. By 1836, routes west were also gaining new meaning. Missionaries, emigrants, traders, and guides moved through some of the same corridors that furmen knew. The mountains were no longer only the working ground of trappers in the popular imagination. They were becoming part of larger overland movement tied to the Oregon country, missions, forts, and the widening American hunger for western passage. That future did not arrive all at once. It crept along trails, across rivers, through camps, and into conversations where one man talked of beaver and another talked of families going west. For the mountain man, this could be unsettling in a way that is easy to miss. His knowledge remained valuable. Routes, water, passes, animals, weather signs, and native diplomacy were still matters of life and death. But the meaning of that knowledge was changing. A skill that once served the beaver trade might soon serve guides, military expeditions, emigrant parties, or settlements. The man who knew how to survive in winter could still be needed, but the world that had made him famous was shifting under his feet. The source record sometimes treats this change as background, because people living through transitions do not always label them neatly. A man does not sit by the fire and announce that he represents the declining phase of the Rocky Mountain rendezvous economy. If he did, the others would probably ask him to bring more wood. But his choices reveal the pressure. Does he keep trapping? Does he hire on as a guide? Does he move toward trade, fort life, farming, scouting, or some other uncertain future? Does he continue because he knows nothing else? Winter makes these questions less philosophical. A bad season can push a man toward a new life faster than a speech ever could. There is a class layer here as well. Men with capital, credit, company backing, strong relationships, or recognized skill could adapt more easily. A poorly supplied trapper with debts and weakening animals had fewer graceful exits. He might take worse terms, accept riskier work, sell low, borrow high, or stay in the mountains because leaving required resources he did not have. Freedom, again, becomes complicated when the door out of hardship has a price on it. Indigenous communities experienced these changes in far deeper and more consequential ways. The fur trade altered animal populations, trade patterns, diplomacy, conflict, disease exposure, material culture, and power relations across regions. Some native groups used trade strategically and powerfully. Others faced intensifying pressure as outside movement grew. By the late 1830s, the trails and camps that helped mountain men survive were also part of a larger transformation that would bring far more people into indigenous homelands. A winter story about trappers cannot honestly float above that ground. Still, the night in camp remains small. The man does not feel history as an era. He feels it as a bad price, a damaged trap, a hungry horse, a rumor about better work, a trader's account, a stream that no longer seems worth the cold it costs. He may feel stubborn, he may feel trapped, he may feel proud of skills that fewer people understand and more people want to use. The old life is not over, but its edges are fraying. This gives the winter another kind of danger. It is not only the risk of dying before spring, it is the risk of surviving into a world where survival itself pays less than it used to. A man can make it through the snow and still discover that the trade which shaped him is thinning like smoke. That is a quieter wound than frostbite, but it changes the future all the same. Near the low fire, he turns the trap over again and studies the worn metal. The object has carried him through seasons of work, hunger, bargaining, and cold water. It has promised money, supplies, and identity. Now it reflects a little firelight and gives back no answer. Beyond the camp, the horses breathe, the route waits. Somewhere far away, fashion changes its mind, companies count their profits, and the mountains hold the remaining beaver in streams that grow harder to trust. The worn trap gives back no answer, because tools are honest in a very limited way. They can show rust, bent jaws, a weak spring, a chain link worn thin by seasons of water and stone. But they cannot tell a man whether the life built around them will still hold. That part has to be guessed in the cold, with tired hands and a horse breathing somewhere behind him. By this late point in the winter story, the old heroic question has become too small. Could a mountain man survive a brutal winter? Yes, sometimes. But the more useful question is, how many small decisions had to go right before survival looked like toughness from a distance? He had to stop before dark often enough. He had to keep powder dry often enough. He had to save food often enough. He had to listen to someone else's knowledge often enough. He had to repair one more seam, check one more animal, wait out one more sky, and ignore one more foolish urge to prove something to weather. That last part mattered. Winter punished performance. A man who needed to look brave at the wrong moment could become a problem for everyone. Crossing a river too late, pushing a weak horse too far, hunting beyond safe return, refusing to admit numb feet, mocking caution because it sounded soft. These were not personality quirks in the mountains. They were expenses, and the group might have to pay them. So the final survival logic is almost disappointingly plain. Eat when there is food, but save what must be saved. Move when movement helps, and stay when staying prevents a worse disaster. Keep your feet dry if you can. Keep your hands working. Keep your animals alive. Keep one eye on the sky and the other on the men around you. Mend things before the tear becomes a sentence. Do not spend summer goods as if winter has forgotten your name. Do not confuse a good story with a good plan. This is where the camp becomes a school with no blackboard. Every object is teaching. The blanket teaches that warmth is stored labour. The rifle teaches that food depends on dry powder, steady hands, and luck. The horse teaches that human ambition has ribs. The kettle teaches that hunger is easier to discuss after something is in it. The moccasin teaches that the journey stops at the foot. The trap teaches that money can freeze into useless iron if the world around it changes. A man who survived long enough learned to hear these lessons before they shouted. He might notice that the snow had changed underfoot, that the horses were taking longer to feed, that one companion had become too quiet, that the wind smelled of weather moving over the ridge, that a fire using too much fuel tonight would make tomorrow harder. These are not mystical powers. They are attention made sharp by consequences. And yet, attention did not guarantee survival. That is important. Careful men died. Skilled men made one bad decision. Experienced travellers met storms no one could outthink. Horses failed. Food vanished. Violence entered. Illness worsened. Ice broke. A valley that looked promising gave nothing. The responsible story cannot turn survival into a moral reward. The mountains did not keep a list of deserving men. They kept conditions. Still, a pattern remains. The men most likely to endure were not always the loudest, strongest, or most legendary. They were often the ones who understood limits. A man who could accept an ugly camp because it had wood and shelter might live longer than the man chasing a prettier valley. A man who could trade fairly, ask quietly, follow a route he did not invent, or learn from people he once underestimated, had more tools than the man who called every caution fear. The same logic applied inside camp. Survival was not only individual endurance, It was a discipline of not wasting other people's strength. Do not make others search for your lost horse because you tied it badly. Do not soak the shared bedding through carelessness. Do not eat as if no one else has a stomach. Do not fire a shot unless the possible meat is worth the powder. Do not begin an argument at the hour when everyone is coldest, unless you truly believe frostbite needs entertainment. There is dry humour in these rules because they are ordinary, almost domestic. They sound less like wilderness legend and more like a difficult household where the floor is snow and the landlord is weather. But that is exactly the point. The deadly winter was survived through domestic acts made severe: drying, mending, cooking, packing, checking, sharing, waiting, listening, counting, carrying, stopping. The extraordinary life was held together by ordinary verbs. The sources make heroes out of the moments that break the pattern: a desperate crossing, a starving march, a narrow escape, a violent meeting, a storm that deserves a paragraph. But the larger truth sits in all the days that did not become famous, the days when the fire was placed well, the days when the horse was checked in time, the days when someone decided not to cross, the days when a woman repaired, processed, cooked, translated, or advised, and the later story forgot to bring her name along. The days when native knowledge redirected a party away from disaster, and a later reader heard only that the trapper knew the country. So if we return to the man beside the low fire, the one turning the worn trap in his hands, we can see him differently now. He is not a statue of wilderness masculinity. He is a tired worker inside a cold economy, a traveller inside indigenous homelands, a debtor to animals, weather, trade, memory, and other people. His courage matters, but it is only one item in the pack, and not always the heaviest. He sets the trap down. Maybe tomorrow it will go back into water. Maybe it will be repaired. Maybe it will be carried east with other goods. Maybe it will be left behind because the horse cannot bear one more piece of iron. The choice will not feel symbolic to him. It will feel practical, which is usually how history hides its symbols from the people living inside them. The fire lowers again. The camp has eaten what it can. The animals stand in the dark, making the soft, necessary sounds of survival still breathing. The repaired moccasin waits near his foot. A blanket holds a little warmth and a lot of smoke. The trap lies where he can reach it if morning gives him work to do. Everything that keeps him alive is close enough to touch, and every one of those things can fail. Everything that keeps him alive is close enough to touch, and every one of those things can fail. That is the truth he carries into the last dark hours before morning, not as a grand thought, not as a sentence for a book, but as a list his hands already know. Blanket, rifle, powder, knife, trap, kettle, horse, moccasin, fire, meat if there is any left, the names of people who might help, the names of places where a man should not be when the weather turns. The fire is low now, and low fire changes the camp. It removes the easy confidence that comes when flames are high and faces are bright. Men become shapes again. Packs become humps in the dark. The horse sounds farther away than it is. The cold presses close, not violently, but steadily, like something waiting for the room to shrink. Someone shifts under a blanket. Someone breathes through a cough. Someone wakes halfway, listens, decides the camp is still there, and sinks back down. This is where a deadly winter does its quietest work. It does not need to roar every hour. It can wait beside the coals and take payment in sleep. A man who never sleeps deeply becomes slower. A man who is slower makes poor knots, late fires, bad crossings, missed shots, careless repairs. The winter gets into the future through fatigue. It does not have to defeat the body in one night if it can make tomorrow's decisions weaker. The man near the fire knows this, even if he would not explain it that way. He pulls the blanket closer, then loosens it enough that damp cloth can breathe. He keeps the moccasins near warmth, but not close enough for sparks. He checks the powder by habit. He turns his head once toward the animals. The horse is there. That small sound is a blessing with hooves. Somewhere beyond this one camp, other men are making similar calculations in other valleys, along other creeks, near other half-dead fires. Some are better supplied. Some are worse. Some have native kinship ties, guides, partners, wives, or trading relationships that make the country less lonely than the legend later pretends. Some are company men, moving inside a discipline they resent but need. Some are free trappers, carrying the cost of their own choices in every pocket. Some will become stories. Some will become names. Some will become nothing visible at all in the record. The record, if it remembers them, will probably do so unevenly. It may give the famous survivor 3 paragraphs and the dead man half a line. It may remember a trapper's hunger and forget the woman who processed the food that prevented worse hunger. It may describe the cold and leave out the person who repaired the clothing. It may turn an indigenous route into a white man's instinct, because the archive is often very talented at misplacing credit. The silence in this winter is not empty. It is crowded. Near dawn, the cold often feels sharper, as if the night is making one last argument before losing. The sky begins to pale behind timber and ridge. Snow that was grey becomes blue. Breath shows and disappears. The fire has settled into ash with a few red points buried inside, still alive if treated gently. A careless boot could scatter them. A careful hand can bring them back. He wakes before the full light. Or perhaps he never fully slept. There is a difference. But after enough winter nights, the difference becomes less important. He reaches first for what matters, the moccasin. The leather is still stiff, but not dead hard. The repaired seam has held. He works it in his hands with slow pressure, not too close to the coals, not too fast. The motion is small and patient, the kind of motion no legend knows what to do with. Around him, camp returns in pieces. A man coughs and sits up. Another mutters at the cold as if the cold might apologize. The horses move, and one bell gives a dull little note. Someone stirs the ash, finds heat, feeds it a sliver of wood, waits for smoke, then flame. The first smoke of morning lifts straight for a moment before the air pushes it sideways. The kettle is reached for. The day begins not with courage but with tasks. This is the ending image the winter gives us. Not a man conquering the mountains, but a man persuading one more morning to function. He does not beat the cold. He manages a fire. He does not defeat hunger. He saves a little food, finds a little more, and hopes the hunt does not fail. He does not master distance. He reads the sky, watches the horse, and stops before dark when wisdom is stronger than pride. He does not escape dependence. He survives through it. And that dependence runs in every direction. Back to the summer rendezvous with its goods and debts. Back to indigenous roots and knowledge. Back to hands that worked hides, repaired seams, cooked meat, translated words, carried children, tended fires, and vanished from many written pages. Back to animals that turned human plans into movement. Back to distant markets where a fashionable hat could help decide whether a man in the mountains had reason to stand in freezing water for beaver. The deadliest part of such a winter was not always the spectacular storm. It was the chain of small failures that could gather until a man had no spare warmth, no spare food, no spare horse, no spare dry powder, no spare daylight, no spare trust. Survival was the opposite chain, one seam holding, one coal kept alive, one horse still breathing, one route remembered, one warning respected, one meal shared, one foolish crossing delayed until morning. By the time the sun lifts, the camp is already moving inside the pale light. Not quickly. Quickly as for men who have forgotten what winter charges. The trap is packed or left, depending on need. The blanket is shaken. The moccasin takes the foot again. The horse lowers its head, then accepts the load. Smoke rises from the old fire and thins into the cold air, carrying no names with it. If a later record mentions this day at all, it may say they moved camp, found game, suffered cold, crossed a creek, lost an animal, or continued on. It will not capture the full weight of that first step in the repaired moccasin. It will not show every hand that made the step possible. But in that step is the real answer. The mountain man survived when enough fragile things held together until dawn, and when he was wise enough to know that dawn was not victory. It was only permission to begin again.